It started on a cloudless afternoon, 30,000 feet above the ground, aboard a routine commercial flight bound for Washington, D.C. But what unraveled in the cabin would become anything but ordinary. She boarded like everyone else, dressed with understated elegance, her eyes calm yet distant, carrying nothing but a briefcase and the silent armor worn by those too familiar with being questioned before being welcomed. From the moment she stepped into first class, something shifted, not in turbulence, but in tone. A glance, a smirk, a refusal masked as protocol. And by the time she struggled for air, clutching her chest while others turned away, one truth became terrifyingly clear. Some people are denied humanity at 30,000 feet just as easily as they are on the ground. What no one knew, not the sneering attendant, not the oblivious supervisor, not the bystanders who hesitated before helping, was that this black woman wasn't just another passenger. She was someone with the power to shake the very system that tried to humiliate her. And she did. If you're drawn to stories of truth, justice, and unexpected power, hit like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And what moment shook you the most? This is more than a flight. This is a reckoning. At 6:47 p.m., Terminal D at Chicago O'Hare was swamped with noise and movement. The intercom blared boarding announcements, luggage wheels clicked over polished tiles, and weary travelers hustled to find their gates. Amid the crowd, Octavia Lorne moved with quiet elegance, her burgundy trench coat fluttering with each step, and her low-heeled boots making muted contact with the floor. She exuded composure, the kind earned through years of hard work, long nights, and knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. The corners of her eyes showed the faintest signs of fatigue, but her gaze was steady. In her hand was a crisp boarding pass, Flight 313 to Phoenix, Seat 2A, First Class. Her assistant had booked it weeks ago, double confirmed through the airline's Platinum Tier client system. This wasn't just a ticket, it was acknowledgement of the position she had earned in life. And she wasn't just flying for leisure. She had just delivered a keynote speech at a legal equity conference and was due to attend a closed-door advisory meeting the following day. As she reached the gate, she offered a soft good evening to the uniformed gate agent, who barely looked up before scanning her ticket. "Thank you, Ms. Lorne. Enjoy your flight," the woman said absently, motioning her through. Octavia stepped onto the jet bridge, her pulse steady but her instincts prickling. She always felt the shift, the invisible tension when she entered certain spaces. Not overt hostility, no. It was subtler. The glances, the way people's expressions flickered for just a second too long. She had learned to ignore it, to rise above. But the moment she crossed the threshold of the aircraft, she felt it all over again. "Welcome aboard," said a tall, angular blonde woman standing at the first-class entrance. Her name tag gleamed, Kendra. The smile on her face didn't reach her eyes. Kendra Holtz was a seasoned flight attendant, known among colleagues for her strict adherence to hierarchy and decorum. She greeted a man behind Octavia with a cheerful "Right this way, sir," then turned back to her. Her gaze flicked up and down, coat, curls, skin tone. "Ma'am," she said, arching a brow. "First class is at the front of the aircraft." Octavia blinked once, offered a pleasant nod, and handed her the boarding pass. "Yes, that's where I'm headed. Seat 2A. Kendra took it, examined it for a second too long, and tilted her head. "Huh, that's odd." She looked at Octavia again, the smile now thin, tight. "Would you mind stepping aside for a moment?" Behind them, more passengers filed in. A few glanced at the two women, curiosity piqued by the halt in the boarding process. Octavia's smile faltered, but she nodded and stepped to the side. She was used to delays, to proving her legitimacy in spaces where people didn't expect her to belong. Kendra turned and walked toward the galley, speaking quietly into the intercom. Another attendant, a younger brunette named Erica, approached. She looked at Octavia and smiled nervously, then quickly looked away. 2 minutes passed, 3, then 5. Octavia stood there with the patience of someone who knew how quickly the narrative could turn against her if she raised her voice. Kendra returned, now joined by the flight's purser, an older man with silver hair and a stiff posture. "There seems to be some confusion with the manifest," Kendra said flatly. We've had a VIP seat reassignment. I'll need to escort you to a different seat." "Excuse me," Octavia said. Her tone was still polite, but her voice had steel. "My seat is 2A. It was confirmed. Paid for. I have a receipt if you'd like to see it." "That won't be necessary," the purser said, already motioning toward the back. "We've made accommodations in the main cabin." "Main cabin," Octavia repeated. The humiliation was a slow burn, spreading through her chest like acid. "I paid for first class." Kendra gave a tight-lipped smile. "These things happen sometimes. We appreciate your cooperation." Octavia hesitated, acutely aware of the eyes on her. A white man in a tailored navy blazer and loafers stepped around her and slid into 2A without hesitation. No one questioned him. No one asked for his ticket. Octavia followed Kendra in silence as they walked past a curtain dividing luxury from everything else. She was seated 3 rows from a lavatory, beside a man chewing loudly on sunflower seeds and a teenager who refused to remove her backpack. Her briefcase barely fit beneath the seat. There was no space, no dignity, and no explanation. 5 minutes later, Kendra returned with a small plastic cup of water. "Here you go," she said, setting it down without eye contact. "Sorry for the mix-up." Then she was gone. Her knees grazed the seat in front of her, and the man to her left had already commandeered both armrests. Headphones in, gum popping. Her briefcase, once resting neatly in the first-class overhead bin, had not been returned. When she asked Kendra about it minutes earlier, the flight attendant had simply waved her off, claiming it was being sorted. The words had been accompanied by a smirk. Octavia had noticed the way Kendra turned toward a younger flight attendant, whispering something with a roll of her eyes. She didn't hear every word, but she heard enough, always trying to hustle an upgrade. The dismissal wasn't just policy, it was personal. That phrase wrapped itself around Octavia's thoughts as the plane rolled slowly toward the runway. Every part of her posture remained rigid, and every cell in her body seemed to throb with a dull, building ache that came from years of navigating spaces like these. She had seen the pattern before, played out in offices, hotels, and conference halls. Now, it was happening 36,000 feet in the air. Her voice hadn't been loud, hadn't cracked or pleaded when she tried to explain herself. That made it easier for them to pretend she was just being difficult. But inside, her chest was tightening, not from panic, but from a deeply familiar sorrow. This wasn't new. It was just sharper than usual. As the jet engines roared and the plane lifted off, Octavia shut her eyes and tried to slow her breath. She didn't want to cry. Not here. Not in front of these strangers. She pictured her suitcase in that first-class compartment, likely still in its spot, ignored or possibly rifled through. Her journal was inside. Her notes. Her private letters from students she'd mentored, thanking her for helping them win court cases or earn scholarships. That journal was more than a notebook. It was the proof of her life's work. The thought of it sitting unattended, or worse, being tossed out like forgotten trash, made her jaw clench. As the seatbelt sign pinged off, the man beside her immediately reclined his chair without warning, jamming the seat back into her knees. She inhaled sharply, wincing, and tried to shift her legs to the side. The tray table in front of her had sticky remnants of something spilled earlier, a sugary stain that hadn't been wiped clean. The flight attendants began moving down the aisle with the beverage cart. Kendra was back again, still stiff, still cold. As she passed Octavia's row, she glanced down once, then kept rolling. "Excuse me," Octavia said, her voice low but firm. Kendra paused, turning slowly as if being interrupted were a chore. "Yes. I'd like a glass of water, please. And can you check on my luggage? I haven't received it back." Kendra raised a brow. "The cart's going forward first. I'll circle back." The answer felt rehearsed, too practiced, as if Octavia was being filed into a mental folder labeled "not worth the trouble." Kendra turned her attention to a man across the aisle and offered him a drink with a bright smile, calling him sir, and joking about airline wine tasting like vinegar. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Octavia folded her hands in her lap and said nothing. She'd spent years training her expression to betray nothing. She'd learned in courtrooms, in board meetings, and in interviews that silence was often the only shield she had. But silence in a space like this didn't make her invisible. It made her dismissible. Across the aisle, a teenage girl in a hoodie watched the interaction unfold. Her brows furrowed, and she tugged on her mother's sleeve. The mother glanced up, then gently shook her head. "Not our business," she whispered. But it was someone's business. Or it should have been. The beverage cart never circled back. Octavia never got her water. The seat back in front of her remained jammed into her knees, and the flight crew never returned her luggage. She pressed the call button once, then again after 10 minutes. No one came. She finally gave up and turned her head toward the window, hoping the dim view of the sky would bring calm. It didn't. The dull ache in her lower back intensified. Her left arm was pinned, unable to move without nudging the man beside her, who had since dozed off with his elbow digging into her ribs. Her throat was dry, her breathing shallow from the recycled air. She needed her inhaler, tucked into the side pocket of her briefcase. But of course, the briefcase wasn't here. Panic hadn't yet set in, but the frustration was growing heavy. Not just because of the air, because of what this flight was becoming. A physical manifestation of all the indignities she'd spent her life quietly enduring. This was supposed to be a simple journey. A seat, a cup of tea, a chapter or two of the book she'd been meaning to finish. Instead, it was something else. It was a stage, and she had been unwillingly cast as the woman who didn't belong. The seat's cushion had worn down to a hard patch, and every shift of her weight reminded her that no one had even attempted to make her comfortable. Even when passengers across the aisle offered smiles or nods, it felt more like pity than solidarity. One woman mouthed sorry, but didn't speak up. Octavia didn't blame her. Speaking up had its own costs. She had done it before and learned quickly that being the angry black woman could get her banned from more than flights. It could get her professionally ghosted, socially sidelined, silenced in the spaces that claimed to be inclusive. The man next to her stirred, elbowing her again as he adjusted. She finally whispered, "Please, could you be mindful of the armrest?" He grunted, but didn't apologize. He simply shifted and reclined even farther. Her spine ached. Her hands trembled. Not from fear, from restraint. For the first time since the flight began, Octavia considered pressing the call button again, but didn't. What would be the point? To be ignored once more? Or, worse, to be treated as disruptive? The weight of her exhaustion finally began to settle in her bones. She leaned her forehead against the window, the cool glass pressing against her skin. The captain's voice came on, announcing expected turbulence ahead. But inside Octavia, the turbulence had already started. Her tongue pressed against the roof of her mouth in search of moisture that wasn't there. She was still waiting for that cup of water. Her lips parted slightly, and her fingers hovered near the call button again. The man beside her shifted once more, elbow pressing back into her space, murmuring in his sleep. She didn't move, didn't ask again. Not yet. She'd already pressed that button twice before, and each time it had been met with nothing. Not a glance, not a word, just the quiet void of intentional neglect. Up ahead, the beverage cart clinked closer, its wheels squeaking slightly as it rolled row by row. Kendra Holt stood behind it, mechanically pouring drinks, her voice light and cheerful as she handed out sodas and mini liquor bottles to the first few rows. The smile on her face returned with each interaction, but only with the passengers she chose to see. Octavia straightened her spine, willing calm into her expression as the cart neared. She waited. They served the row ahead of hers, the man across the aisle cracking a joke about airline whiskey. Kendra laughed, offered him 2 bottles, winked. Octavia's heart thudded louder. Then, with barely a glance in her direction, the cart rolled past. Her mouth dropped slightly in disbelief. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but urgent. Kendra didn't stop. The younger attendant at the back of the cart turned her head slightly, but when Kendra didn't respond, she said nothing. Octavia reached up and tapped the call button for the 3rd time. The light blinked above her seat. Still nothing. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The cart was now 3 rows ahead. The man across the aisle leaned toward her, brow furrowed. "Did they skip you?" he asked quietly. "Apparently," Octavia replied, her voice tight. She pressed the button again. Another 5 minutes dragged by. The blinking light above her went ignored. The couple across from her, middle-aged, casual dress, kind eyes, began to take notice. The woman murmured to her partner, who pulled out his phone and opened the camera app, angling it subtly toward the aisle. Octavia wasn't sure whether to feel grateful or mortified. She hated being seen like this, reduced to a moment, a spectacle. But she also knew silence protected no one. When the cart circled back finally, Kendra stopped beside her row without looking directly at her. "Can I get you anything?" she asked, her tone flat. "Just water," Octavia replied. "Please." Kendra opened the tray of plastic cups and poured. But instead of handing it to Octavia, she turned and reached across the aisle first, giving 2 drinks to the couple across. Then she handed another to the passenger in the middle seat. When she finally turned back to Octavia, she seemed to hesitate. "Actually," she said, "maybe next time try flying with manners." The words were quiet, but not quiet enough. A few heads turned. Octavia's breath hitched. "Excuse me," she asked. "I asked politely." 3 times. Kendra tilted her head, her smile mocking now. "We have procedures, ma'am. If you can't wait your turn like everyone else, perhaps this isn't the right seat for you." The man across the aisle stiffened. "I saw you skip her," he said, not raising his voice but speaking with clear authority. "She was patient. More than you deserve." Kendra's smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you not to escalate things." The woman beside him tapped her phone screen. "We've got it all recorded, just so you know." A flicker of something passed across Kendra's face, but she recovered quickly. "Ma'am, if you'd like to make a complaint, you can do so after landing. Right now, I have a job to do." She set the cup of water down on Octavia's tray table with enough force that the liquid splashed over the rim. Then she pushed the cart forward without another word. Octavia stared down at the trembling cup, hands clenched tightly in her lap. Her throat burned, not just from thirst, but from the heat of humiliation rising up to her ears. She didn't dare look at anyone, didn't dare speak. It was the tone in Kendra's voice that stung the most. That mix of contempt and forced politeness. The way she wielded professionalism like a weapon. Everything about that moment screamed, "You don't belong." And everyone knows it. She sipped the water slowly, letting the cold touch of it cool her from the inside out, but the shaking didn't stop. She wasn't afraid. She was exhausted. This wasn't her first experience with institutional bias. But the way it unfolded here, with nowhere to go, thousands of feet in the air, boxed in and voiceless, made it feel like a new kind of punishment. The flight had become a theater, and she the unwilling star in a performance she never auditioned for. Every whisper, every glance from nearby rows, carved a deeper groove in her resolve. When the cart finally disappeared down the aisle, and Kendra was no longer in view, the woman across the aisle leaned forward. The tension behind her breastbone deepened, dull and creeping, the kind of sensation she recognized too well. She had learned to manage her asthma over the years through meditation, controlled breathing, and, when necessary, medication. But her inhaler was in her briefcase, which still had not been returned. Her hands began to tremble again, not from emotion this time, but from the subtle yet unmistakable signs of a respiratory event beginning to take hold. She reached for the call button, pressing it with a level of urgency she hadn't used earlier. The overhead light blinked softly, then nothing. Minutes passed. Kendra never came. The tightness escalated. Her throat itched. The air felt thinner, heavier. Her breaths became more shallow. She placed her hand over her chest and closed her eyes, counting slowly. One breath in, one breath out, trying to focus. But her lungs didn't cooperate. Panic, the kind that she usually kept buried beneath logic and poise, scratched at the edges of her composure. This was no longer about discomfort. This was danger. She pressed the button again. This time longer. Again, nothing. She opened her mouth to speak, but her voice came out hoarse, dry, too soft to carry over the ambient noise of the cabin. Her seatmate was still asleep, earphones on, oblivious. The couple across the aisle noticed her movement and leaned forward. The woman tilted her head. "Are you okay?" she asked. Octavia tried to respond, but coughed instead. A raspy, wrenching cough that sounded worse than it felt. The man stood slightly, waving toward the front of the plane. "She needs help," he called out. "Can we get someone?" A ripple of alertness spread around them. Kendra, several rows up, turned her head slowly. A forced expression of calm stretched across her face. She made her way down the aisle with deliberate slowness, pausing to adjust something in the galley before approaching Octavia. "Ma'am," she asked, voice chipper but hollow. "What's the matter now?" Octavia raised a shaky hand toward her throat. "Asthma," she managed to whisper. "Inhaler luggage." Kendra blinked. "Well, if it's in your bag, and your bag's not here, then there's not much I can do, is there?" "Oxygen," Octavia rasped. "Please." Kendra didn't move. "We have limited resources for emergencies, ma'am. Are you sure this isn't just a bit of anxiety? Turbulence can do that to people." The woman across the aisle stood abruptly. "She's clearly not okay," she snapped. "She needs help." Kendra turned to her, her professional smile faltering. "Ma'am, I'll ask you to remain seated. I am handling it." The man next to her stood as well. "No, you're not. You've ignored her the entire flight. She's asked for help 3 times now." A second cough escaped Octavia's lips, sharper this time. Her vision was blurring at the edges, not from tears, but from a lack of oxygen. Her muscles began to feel heavy, her hands clammy. Another attendant emerged from a galley, Erica, the younger one, and glanced between Kendra and the unfolding scene with wide eyes. "There's an oxygen tank under the seat," the man across the aisle said suddenly, pointing toward the jump seat near the galley. "Right there, under hers." Octavia followed the gesture and saw it, a small, regulation green tank tucked neatly into a recess by the crew seat. She tried to speak again, but it came out as a gasp. "That's for medical use," Kendra said, folding her arms. She didn't make it clear this was a real emergency. "She can't breathe," the woman shot back. "What more clarity do you need?" She didn't ask nicely, Kendra muttered under her breath, loud enough for those closest to hear. The words landed like stones. Octavia's eyes widened slightly as she struggled to process the cruelty of what she'd just heard. Her chest tightened further, and for a moment, she thought she might pass out. The couple across from her began to argue more loudly. Erica stepped forward uncertainly. "Kendra, I think we should—" "Erica," Kendra snapped, "go back to prep for service." Erica hesitated. "But that's an order." Erica retreated. The man reached forward and tapped Octavia's shoulder gently. "You hang in there, all right," he said. "We're not letting this slide." "Tell them," Octavia managed, her voice cracking with effort. "Inhaler, gray case." The man nodded. "We'll get it. Where is your bag?" "First class overhead." He turned to walk up the aisle, but Kendra stepped in front of him. "Sir, sit down. You're not authorized to access that area." "Then go get it," he said firmly. "Or I will." Kendra looked ready to argue, but something in his tone must have warned her off. She turned and walked briskly toward the front of the plane. Octavia leaned her head back, eyes fluttering. The pressure in her chest reached a crescendo. She was aware of voices around her, of movement, but the world felt distant. Then, moments later, she felt a mask pressed gently to her face, the hiss of oxygen breaking through the fog. Not from Kendra, but from Erica, who had defied orders and brought the tank. Octavia took one breath, then another. The air sliced through the tightness like water on fire. Relief didn't come instantly, but it came. The man returned a minute later with her briefcase, gray and scuffed. Inside, her inhaler was quickly retrieved, and the medicine reached her lungs in 2 desperate pulls. The oxygen mask now sat unused in her lap, a lifeline offered not by policy, but by decency, and only because a junior flight attendant had chosen to defy orders. She blinked slowly, trying to push through the fog in her head, the ringing still faint in her ears. The low hum of passenger voices buzzed around her, but she couldn't quite focus on what they were saying. She knew eyes were on her, some concerned, some curious, others cold and judgmental. But she didn't dare meet any of them. She was too exhausted to brace against whatever expressions they might carry. Still gripping the armrest with her left hand, she turned slightly toward the window to find a shred of privacy in the crowded, claustrophobic space. The gray clouds outside rolled by like silent witnesses to her degradation. A few rows away, Kendra stood near the galley with a paper cup in hand, her posture relaxed, her voice low but clearly audible. She leaned slightly toward another attendant and nodded in Octavia's direction. "Bet she's faking it for sympathy," Kendra said, then took a sip. "That kind of woman always does." The words landed in Octavia's chest with more impact than the asthma attack had. Her body tensed, her eyes stung. There was no ambiguity in what Kendra meant. No pretense of professionalism, no mask of neutrality. Just venom slithering between her teeth like it belonged there. The attendant beside her, Erica again, stiffened but didn't respond. She kept her eyes on the floor, the silence between them louder than words. A few passengers nearby heard the comment. The couple who had come to Octavia's defense looked up sharply. The man's face darkened with fury, but he didn't speak, not yet. A young boy, maybe 8 or 9, sitting in the row ahead of Octavia, turned around in his seat with a juice box in hand. His eyes were wide and sincere, the way only children's eyes could be. He leaned across the aisle and whispered, "Would you like some? My mom says juice helps when I feel dizzy." The kindness in his voice was disarming. Octavia's lips parted in surprise, but before she could speak, Kendra swooped down the aisle with practiced speed. She plucked the juice box from the child's hand, eyes narrowing. "That's not allowed," she snapped. "We don't give charity on this flight." The boy's mother gasped. "Excuse me," she said, standing halfway up. "He was just trying to help." "Ma'am, I'll need you to stay seated and keep your child from interfering with crew operations," Kendra said coldly. She dropped the juice box onto the service tray and continued down the aisle. The boy looked confused, then hurt. Octavia forced a breath, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Thank you," she whispered to him. "That was very kind." His face lit up briefly, but the sting of Kendra's words still lingered in his young eyes. The mother sat down slowly, shaking her head. "This is outrageous," she muttered. Octavia nodded weakly. Her voice caught somewhere between gratitude and exhaustion. More and more passengers were taking notice now. The murmurs grew in volume. One man took out his phone again, aiming it toward the galley where Kendra was talking and laughing with another crew member. Someone else asked aloud, "Is she always like this?" The cabin wasn't riotous, it wasn't even loud, but the shift was undeniable. A ripple of disapproval moved through the rows, as if passengers were finally beginning to feel the discomfort that Octavia had been forced to swallow for the past 2 hours. Still, Octavia said nothing. She didn't have the strength to rise, not yet. Her dignity had already been paraded through the narrow aisle like a spectacle. She refused to give them more. But the silence from the airline staff, aside from Erica, was deafening. No one from the cockpit came. No official apology. Just Kendra's back, retreating down the aisle, her posture as smug as it had been when she'd first questioned Octavia's presence in first class. The beverage cart returned again, but this time Erica was in charge. She paused beside Octavia's row and looked her in the eye. "Would you like anything to drink? Water? Juice?" she asked softly. Octavia shook her head. "Thank you. I'm fine." Erica hesitated, then leaned closer. "I'm really sorry," she whispered. "I don't agree with what she said, or what she did." Octavia met her gaze, saw the sincerity there. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse. Erica offered a small, sad smile before moving on. Across the aisle, the man who had stood up earlier leaned over again. "We've got this on video," he said. "You don't have to stay silent. If you want, we'll report it with you." Octavia's muscles had stopped shaking, but her body felt numb, suspended in a strange stillness between despair and calculation. She had stopped asking questions, had stopped pleading, had even stopped hoping anyone in uniform would act. And yet, the murmurs around her continued to swell into something else. One row back and across the aisle, a woman in navy scrubs stood up abruptly, her eyes fixed on Octavia with instant clinical concern. "I'm a nurse," she said, voice cutting through the background noise. She's still pale. Is anyone monitoring her oxygen levels? Her question wasn't rhetorical. It was loaded with indignation. The passengers around her turned. She had an asthma attack, the woman explained to those near her. This isn't something you brush off. She could go back into respiratory distress. The nurse took a step into the aisle, moving quickly toward Octavia's row. Has someone updated the captain? Has this been logged as an in-flight emergency? She asked, scanning the attendants at the back. Kendra, who had been restocking the beverage cart, looked up. Her face flashed with something halfway between annoyance and disdain. Ma'am, please return to your seat. We have the situation under control. The nurse stopped cold, her arms crossed. Under control? She didn't get oxygen until another passenger had to retrieve the tank. You ignored 3 call buttons and mocked her in front of witnesses. I have medical authority to respond, and I want to speak to the pilot. That won't be necessary, Kendra replied, stepping into the aisle, effectively blocking the path. Please sit down. I will not, the nurse shot back. You've demonstrated negligence. I'm escalating this now. With deliberate movement, the nurse turned toward the nearest phone panel on the wall and lifted it, calling for the cockpit. Kendra's tone shifted slightly, now more tense. You're disrupting the cabin. Please comply before we're forced to restrain you. The threat hung in the air like a punch. The nurse stared at her. You're threatening a medical professional for trying to protect a patient? The argument had drawn the attention of nearly the entire rear cabin. Passengers were now fully engaged, craning necks, phones rising into the air again. Even those who had previously stayed quiet were beginning to speak to each other, disbelief sharpening into outrage. Octavia sat motionless, eyes low, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. She didn't speak. She didn't interrupt. But every word exchanged added another weight to her silence. From the front of the cabin, a male voice spoke up suddenly. What the hell is going on back there? It was strong, authoritative. Another man emerged from first class, tall, early 50s, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit. He walked with purpose toward the commotion. I heard a passenger had a medical emergency. Why wasn't the pilot informed? Kendra's expression shifted again, this time to something closer to panic masked beneath control. Sir, please return to your seat. We're resolving it. Resolving it? He repeated, incredulous. Because what it looks like from up front is that someone nearly suffocated while the flight crew stood around pretending it wasn't happening. He looked down at Octavia, then at the nurse. Are you treating her? Trying to, the nurse said, until I was blocked. Unbelievable, the man muttered. He looked at Kendra and pointed. I'm asking you one more time. Have you reported this incident to the captain? Kendra's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Finally, she said, we were just about to. The man narrowed his eyes. You mean you didn't? Kendra hesitated, then offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Relax, sir. She's not dying. She just wants a show. The gasp that followed her statement rippled across the cabin. It wasn't just 1 or 2 shocked reactions. Dozens of passengers turned in their seats, some openly voicing their disgust. Unbelievable, someone muttered. You can't say that, another woman said aloud. You've got people recording this, one man added. The first-class passenger turned and pointed toward Kendra. You're done. You don't get to speak for anyone else on this plane again. At that moment, Erica reappeared, her face pale but resolute. The captain is requesting a full report, she said, and he wants to speak to the nurse and the affected passenger as soon as we land. Kendra's shoulders stiffened. She turned away, muttering something under her breath. The nurse kneeled beside Octavia, checking her pulse, inspecting her breathing. You're going to be okay, she said softly. Just hang in there. You've got people watching now. Octavia nodded faintly, her expression unreadable, her body drained but her eyes alert. The attention no longer scared her. Despite the minor restoration of order, the weight of humiliation clung to Octavia like a second skin. Her body still trembled from the adrenaline crash that followed her asthma attack, and her thoughts swirled in a haze of exhaustion, anger, and aching restraint. But beneath the silence she maintained, something had begun to stir. It wasn't defiance, It was clarity, a cold, precise clarity sharpened by years of watching systems break and refusing to believe in coincidence when discrimination wore such familiar patterns. She was not unknown, she was not invisible, and she was not powerless. Octavia reached down and opened the side zipper of her briefcase, the one finally returned to her after another passenger demanded its presence. Her fingers brushed against her phone, and she pulled it free, the screen lighting her face with a soft glow. Her thumb hovered for only a second before she opened the secure messaging app linked to her federal credentials. With effort, she typed a single coded message: Trigger Legal Code 416A, Emergency Protocol. She pressed send. The phone buzzed once to confirm receipt. She exhaled slowly. Erica, passing by with another water bottle, noticed the movement. "Can I get you something else?" she asked, her voice genuine. Octavia looked up at her, eyes calm now. "No, thank you," she replied, the first full sentence she had spoken since the incident. "I'm fine." The nurse beside her glanced over, surprised by the tonal shift, but said nothing. Across the aisle, the first-class man who had intervened caught her eye again. There was a question in his look, one he didn't ask aloud. Not yet. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. The flight had entered smoother air, but tension clung to the space between every row. And then came the tone, sharp, sudden, unmistakable. A direct call to the cockpit. Not routine, not weather-related. Erica, standing at the front, answered it and listened intently, nodding slowly. She looked toward Octavia with an expression that quickly morphed from confusion to recognition. She lowered the phone, then walked swiftly into the cockpit. Inside, the captain's posture changed as she spoke. He nodded once, then twice, then lifted his own receiver and connected to the cabin PA. His voice came on, calm but measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've received an in-flight directive from federal aviation authorities. There will be a procedural update issued upon landing, and we ask for your cooperation in remaining seated once we arrive." The announcement stirred the cabin. Passengers looked at each other, puzzled. Kendra appeared from the galley, her brows furrowed. "What was that?" she asked, glancing toward the cockpit. Erica stepped out and paused, her gaze fixed directly on Octavia. Then she turned to Kendra. "The passenger in seat 22F has been identified by the FAA." "Identified?" Kendra repeated. "As what?" Erica didn't blink. "As Executive Director of Federal Aviation Safety Audits, and as a federal witness under active flight observation." Kendra's face went slack. Her mouth opened, then closed again. "No, that's not possible," she whispered. She was in economy. She didn't even belong in first class." "That," Erica said, her tone suddenly unyielding, "is the problem." The words rang through the narrow cabin like a gavel. For a moment, everything was still. The nurse looked at Octavia with wide eyes. You work with the FAA?" Octavia nodded once. "I oversee compliance audits, passenger rights enforcement, and emergency response standards." The woman's jaw dropped slightly. "And they treated you like this?" "It's not the first time," Octavia replied quietly. "But it will be the last on this airline." Kendra stepped back, visibly pale now. She tried to speak again, but no words came out. The man from first class leaned into the aisle. "So you're the reason the cabin went dark for 10 minutes." Octavia met his gaze. "I sent a protocol signal. When passenger rights are violated under certain conditions, the FAA monitors real-time enforcement. It's rare, but this met the threshold." "Damn right it did," the nurse muttered. Octavia sat upright now, her posture regaining the strength stripped from her earlier. Her voice carried clarity and weight. "I didn't want to escalate. I didn't want a scene. I wanted a seat I paid for, water I asked for, help I needed. But at every turn, your employee made choices that violated federal aviation law." Kendra opened her mouth, but Octavia lifted a finger, just one. The movement was not dramatic. It was surgical. "No, don't explain. Just listen." Kendra fell silent, visibly shaken. Erica took another step forward, gently but firmly guiding her away from the aisle. Erica remained close to the jump seat, her posture rigid but focused, while Kendra drifted away like a ship losing anchor. The color drained completely from her face. She hovered near the galley, as if seeking a safe corner, but there was none to be found. In seat 22F, Octavia sat in absolute silence, her presence now unmistakably commanding. Her composure had returned, not as a shield, but as a weapon. Her eyes tracked the movement of the crew with quiet intensity, and though she said nothing, her very breath carried authority. The phone near Erica rang once. Then again. She picked it up, nodded, then replaced it and made her way directly to Octavia. "Ma'am," she said with a tone now laced with deference, "the captain would like to speak with you personally." The passengers nearby watched in stillness as Erica gently helped Octavia from her seat. The moment her frame rose from economy, the space seemed to expand. Passengers parted like water around a rock, their eyes filled with a new recognition. The woman who had been mocked, ignored, and physically endangered was now being escorted like royalty, not by demand, but by the acknowledgement of truth. As Octavia stepped past row after row, her head remained high. She didn't look left or right, didn't offer reassurances or seek sympathy. The silence she walked through was heavy with shame, none of it hers. When she reached the first-class curtain, it was already open. The captain, a tall man with graying temples and precise movements, stepped into the aisle to greet her. "Ms. Lorne," he said, offering a hand. "I'm Captain Holbrook. On behalf of this airline and this crew, I sincerely apologize for what you've endured. I've been briefed by the FAA directly. You have full access to my cabin and command during the remainder of this flight." Octavia shook his hand once firmly. "Thank you," she said simply. He nodded and gestured to the seat beside him. 2A, her original assignment, the same seat she had been removed from without cause. As she sat, the symbolism was complete. The captain took the adjoining seat meant for crew use during compliance evaluations. It was an unspoken gesture of solidarity, one that did not go unnoticed. Kendra, still frozen at the edge of economy, was motioned forward by Erica. She approached like a ghost, hands wringing at her sides. Her lips twitched, perhaps trying to form words, but before she could speak, Captain Holbrook raised a hand. "Ms. Holtz," he said, voice firm, "you are relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight. Please take a seat in the crew jump seat. A full report has been logged. Security personnel will meet us on the tarmac." "Sir, she started, but he cut her off. "There is nothing you can say that changes the reality of your actions. You endangered a passenger's life. You mocked her in front of witnesses. And you ignored emergency protocol. Sit down." Her mouth snapped shut, shoulders hunched. She turned and walked away, the murmurs of the watching passengers chasing after her like echoes of justice. Octavia leaned back into her seat, the familiar comfort of first class now something more than upholstery. It was reclamation. The captain stood and returned to the cockpit, but before closing the door, he made one final move. He lifted the intercom and pressed the call button, his voice broadcasting clearly through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We would like to issue a formal apology to one of our passengers who experienced unacceptable treatment earlier on this flight. The incident is now under investigation by the Federal Aviation Administration. We appreciate your cooperation and patience as we complete this journey. Upon landing, all relevant parties will be debriefed. Please remain seated until instructed otherwise. Thank you." The silence that followed was thick with implication. No airline ever admitted wrongdoing mid-flight. No captain ever addressed a specific passenger without euphemisms. But this was different. This wasn't just a mishandled seating arrangement or a delay of service. This was systemic abuse, aired out at 30,000 feet, and justice had pierced through the cabin with undeniable force. In economy, the passengers who had supported Octavia exchanged looks, their expressions a mix of relief and vindication. The nurse wiped at her, eyes discreetly. The child who had offered juice peeked over his seat, waving shyly at Octavia. She smiled and waved back. The moment was small, but it meant something. a bridge rebuilt between people who had been watching injustice unfold in real time. A flight attendant came by with a tray of refreshments, offering Octavia a choice of tea or wine. She accepted the tea, her fingers, steady now, wrapped around the warm porcelain cup. There was no applause for the landing, no relieved sighs or mindless chatter. Instead, there was silence, a collective inhale held tightly in every throat. Octavia remained composed in her first-class seat, her back straight, her gaze steady, hands resting gently on her lap. She had not spoken much since the captain's mid-air announcement. She had no need to. Her silence now spoke louder than any speech, louder than any plea she might have made earlier. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone knew it. The captain's voice came through the intercom again, this time brisk and formal. All passengers, please remain seated until instructed to deplane. Federal officials will be boarding shortly for protocol execution. Thank you for your cooperation. The tone was not a suggestion, it was an order, and it froze any movement instantly. A black SUV rolled up beside the jet bridge, followed by a second, then a third. On the tarmac, figures in navy jackets with bold yellow letters. FAA, DOJ, TSA, emerged and began coordinating. The jet bridge extended. The cabin door clicked and creaked open. The first figures aboard weren't flight attendants or ground staff. They were federal agents. Suited, serious, efficient. They moved past first class without pause and headed directly to the rear galley where Kendra was seated, stiff and pale, hands clenched into the armrest of the crew jump seat. Behind her, her supervisor, who had remained eerily quiet during the entire flight, stood awkwardly, lips pressed into a thin line. The lead agent stopped, showed identification, and spoke in a clipped tone. Kendra Holtz, you are under investigation for violation of federal aviation protocol, endangerment of a passenger, and obstruction of an emergency medical response. Please stand. You can't be serious, Kendra whispered, voice shaking. This is a mistake. I didn't mean, ma'am, the agent interrupted. This is not the time for statements. You are being detained under federal code. Please comply. Two more agents flanked her, one gently guiding her arms behind her back. The clink of handcuffs echoed through the cabin, jarring in the otherwise still atmosphere. A collective gasp rippled through the passengers. Phones went up again, recording not just for spectacle, but as documentation of consequence. The supervisor, sweating and visibly trembling, was next. Diana Moore, the second agent said, failure to report misconduct, suppression of crew error, and dereliction of oversight. She didn't argue. She simply nodded and turned, extending her hands behind her. Her resignation was evident in her silence. They were led down the aisle, their faces ashen, their bodies slumped. A few passengers turned their heads, unable to watch. Others didn't blink. No one applauded. This wasn't entertainment. It was justice, methodical and long overdue. Octavia watched from her seat, her face unreadable. The agents passed her without a word, without a glance, but she felt the recognition in their discipline. This was not just a response. This was a reckoning triggered by her on behalf of countless others. At the bottom of the jet bridge, cameras flashed. Reporters, tipped off by the FAA's emergency bulletin, captured the scene. The CEO of the airline, a tall man with prematurely gray hair and a pinched expression, stood at the edge of the tarmac beside legal counsel and public relations officials. He didn't look at Kendra. He didn't acknowledge her. He waited until the agents passed, and only then looked up toward the plane, as if preparing to climb a mountain of shame. Inside, the captain approached Octavia with a tablet in hand. MS. Lauren, he said, headquarters has asked if you'd be willing to make a public statement. You are not required to, but Octavia held up a hand gently. Give me the camera feed. He tapped the screen, and a red light blinked to life. Her face filled the live stream monitor broadcast to media outlets and the FAA's digital channels. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't hesitate. My name is Octavia Lauren. I am the Executive Director of Federal Aviation Safety Audits. Today, aboard this flight, I experienced not a singular act of negligence, but a sequence of choices, a chain of decisions rooted not in error, but in contempt. I was dismissed, ignored, mocked, and endangered, not because I violated any policy, but because someone assumed I didn't belong. But the truth is, I belong everywhere justice must reach. She paused, eyes steady. No one should beg to breathe, and no one should laugh when they do. The silence that followed her words wasn't hollow, it was reverent. The message was already spreading. Within 20 minutes, it was trending across major platforms. #OctaviaLorne, #Beg to Breathe. Videos taken from inside the plane, paired with her statement, began circulating like wildfire. Comments poured in. Politicians, activists, celebrities, average citizens, all demanding reform. Some angry, some stunned, all awake. As passengers finally began deplaning in an orderly, subdued procession, many passed Octavia's seat and paused, offering quiet thanks or solemn nods. She accepted each with grace, not because she craved praise, but because solidarity had been so absent when she needed it most. The nurse lingered, smiling gently. "If you ever need a witness," she said softly, "I'll be there." "I might," Octavia replied. "And thank you." The boy with the juice box passed last, holding his mother's hand. He looked up at her and said, "You were like the good guys in my cartoons." 3 months had passed since Flight 313 made its descent not just onto a tarmac, but into the heart of a national reckoning. The video of Octavia Lorne's in-flight ordeal had become a cultural touchstone, cited in congressional hearings, university panels, late-night commentaries, and even high school civics classes. Her words had been etched into the conversation like a call to arms. No one should beg to breathe, and no one should laugh when they do. Airline policies changed overnight. The FAA launched an unprecedented inquiry into in-flight discrimination. Training manuals were rewritten. Supervisory roles were audited. Executives were made to account for the silent mechanisms that had long enabled subtle and overt abuse under the guise of procedure. But change, while swift at the top, arrived in more complex shapes among those who had lived at the center of the storm. Kendra Holtz, once a senior flight attendant praised for her efficiency and reliability, found herself at the lowest point of a life she had long thought was immune to consequence. She had been fired within 48 hours of the incident. Her union refused to defend her. Airlines blacklisted her quietly. Background checks flagged her name. Her mugshot, captured mid-blink and pale-faced, circled the internet for weeks. She had hidden from it at first, tried to call it exaggerated, told herself it wasn't as bad as they made it seem. But the silence that met her calls, the friends who stopped replying, the applications that went unanswered, it all spoke louder. Eventually, she moved back into her mother's modest home in Bakersfield, California. She stopped wearing her uniform. She didn't board a plane. She avoided terminals, gates, even travel commercials. She couldn't watch without her chest tightening with shame. But the image that haunted her most wasn't the one captured on camera. It was the memory of Octavia's face, calm and tired, when Kendra had mocked her in front of an entire cabin and then walked away like it meant nothing. That face had come to her in dreams, in the silence of early mornings, in the stillness before she fell asleep. She'd replayed her words 1,000 times. She's not dying. She just wants a show. Each time they echoed, they sounded more monstrous. Then the letter came. It was crisp and official, bearing the insignia of the FAA's Passenger Equity Commission. It wasn't a summons or a legal threat. It was an invitation. She was being asked to testify, not in defense of herself, but as a witness to institutional failure. She hesitated for 2 days. But the third morning, she stood in front of the mirror and didn't look away. She packed a suit that no longer fit quite right and boarded a bus to Washington, D.C. for the first time in her life. The hearing was held in a small auditorium within the Capitol Annex, live-streamed to a national audience. The room was quiet when she stepped up to the podium. Cameras flashed. Committee members nodded politely. She cleared her throat and looked down at her prepared statement. But when she opened her mouth, the words refused to come. Instead, she exhaled, looked up, and spoke from something deeper than any document. "My name is Kendra Holtz, and I am responsible for failing a woman who asked for nothing more than air and dignity. I mocked her. I ignored her. I let my assumptions become actions. And I hurt someone who deserved better." Her voice cracked. "What I did was not just unprofessional. It was inhumane. I didn't see her. I didn't care to. And I was wrong." She paused, then looked out across the room. "I used to think training was enough, that procedures could fix prejudice. But prejudice is personal. It doesn't get solved with a manual. It gets solved when people decide to look at someone and see a human being." When she sat down, the room remained quiet, not out of dismissal, but out of something else, something heavier: reflection. After the hearing, she was ushered into a side room for private debriefs. She expected to be met by lawyers or bureaucrats. But when the door opened, it was Octavia standing there, impeccably dressed in a navy blue suit, her expression unreadable. Kendra froze. "Ms. Lorne," she started, but Octavia raised a hand. "I heard your statement," she said. It was honest. Kendra swallowed hard. "I don't expect forgiveness." Octavia studied her for a long moment. Then she walked to the table and placed a folder in front of her. "This is an enrollment form for the Equity Skies Initiative," she said. "It's a program we launched for former airline personnel to learn, reflect, and reform. We don't just want to punish people. We want to change them." Kendra blinked. "You want me to be part of it?" "If you want to be," Octavia replied. "You made terrible choices. You hurt people. But today, you did something rare. You took responsibility. That matters." Kendra looked down at the form, her hands trembling. "Why me?" Octavia's voice was soft but firm. "Because redemption is only possible when we recognize the brokenness in ourselves. And because the skies are big enough for all of us, but you need to fly right." Tears welled in Kendra's eyes, not for pity, but for the sudden, overwhelming truth of a future that might still hold purpose. "Thank you," she whispered. Octavia nodded. "You'll have to earn it, every day, but you can." In the months that followed, Kendra enrolled in the program, completed modules on unconscious bias, emergency protocols, and conflict de-escalation. She spoke to students, to trainees, to executives. She shared her story, not to cleanse herself, but to warn others. Meanwhile, Octavia continued her work with renewed vigor. Her team expanded. Her words appeared in policy drafts and training modules across major airlines. She remained visible, not out of ego, but out of necessity. Change needed faces. It needed survivors. It needed warriors who bore the scars of systems and chose to rise anyway. The clip of her original speech remained online, now archived in the National Museum of African American History and Culture. School children toured the exhibit. Lawmakers cited it. And each time she was asked what she hoped people would remember, Octavia always gave the same answer: that justice is not a verdict. It's a path, one we must walk every day, not just for ourselves, but for those still begging to breathe. The end. If you found this story powerful or meaningful, consider supporting by liking and subscribing. It helps more people discover these kinds of stories that spark conversation and challenge injustice. I'm curious, what did you think about the plot? Did any particular moment hit hard for you? And where are you watching from? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective and keep this dialogue going.